Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's food safety webinar, Legal Issues in Tribal Food Safety. This first of a two-part series will discuss very specific legal issues pertaining to farms that grow fruits and vegetables in Indian country, and will provide key discussion points to ensure differences in jurisdiction and authority are identified. We will also assist the tribal producer or those producing food on Indian country lands in identifying and spotting key issues that face us as unique producers. This webinar is part of a series of food safety webinars coordinated and conducted by the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative to help Native American farmers, ranchers, and food producers understand the importance of food safety and what is necessary to reach compliance under the Food Safety Modernization Act. The IFAI is also scheduling a series of in-person food safety trainings in regional locations. I encourage you to visit our website at indigenousfoodandag.com/foodsafety for a listing of these trainings and information about how to register. The in-person training events will result in the award of a certificate. The webinars we are hosting will help you better understand these issues and will help prepare you to participate more deeply in the regional training events. We will not award a certificate for the webinar trainings. We're merely trying to broaden knowledge of the important principles that will be covered in the regional training events. If you look at the handout section of your control panel, you'll find the slideshow being presented today. I invite you to visit our website at indigenousfoodandag.com/foodsafety, where you will find more information about our food safety trainings, downloadable copies of the presentations, and archived videos of the completed webinars. All attendees will be muted during the presentation. Today's presenters, Aaron Parker and Tony Stanger, will answer questions at the end of the presentation. Attendees can submit a question at any time during the presentation by using the questions feature of the control panel. Today's presentation is possible through a 3-year cooperative agreement with the U.S. Food and Drug Administration and the IFAI to provide Native American outreach, training, technical assistance, and education to ensure compliance with the Food Safety Modernization Act. Our work is part of the broad efforts we will undertake to provide outreach, training, technical assistance, and education on food safety issues. I'd like to introduce today's presenters, Aaron Parker and Tony Stanger. Aaron currently serves as the Research Director of the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative at the University of Arkansas School of Law, where she supports the initiative through program development, research and writing, and analysis of legislative and regulatory issues affecting tribal governments, businesses, and individual producers. The bulk of her professional work centers on the tension between food and agricultural law and federal Indian law. Most recently, she authored the 2015 Intertribal Food Systems Report, which lifts up nearly 100 different innovative food systems programs across Indian country. Before beginning her work with the initiative, she worked as a staff attorney and research coordinator for the Cabell Commission, a national working group convened by the Secretary of the Interior to repair the federal government's Indian Land Trust Management System. She is a proud law hog and holds both her JD and her LLM from the Agricultural and Food Law from the University of Arkansas. Tony is the Director of Tribal Governments at the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative and founder of IndianCountryGrants.com. After graduating law school, she began working for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Office of the Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights in Washington, D.C. During her time in the Civil Rights Office, she led the office in reviewing thousands of outstanding claims, as well as the settlement of the Keep-Siegel opt-outs, resulting in the protection of more than 380,000 acres of tribal land from foreclosure. Tony moved from the Civil Rights Office to the USDA Office of the Secretary, where she represented the department in working with the U.S. Forest Service on improving sacred sites policies. She now works with tribes in lending, business and infrastructure development, code writing, and agricultural development. I'd like to welcome our panelists and all of our attendees, and I will now hand the presentation over to you, Erin.
All right. Thank you, Brian. And thank you to everyone who's on the webinar here this afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to the first in this general legal issues series. Tony and I are excited to be talking about food safety with y'all this afternoon. Basically, what we're going to do today is walk through some general food safety liability. And hopefully this information is going to help explain why having a food safety plan is so important. Because even if we didn't have the Food Safety Modernization Act, which we certainly do, even if we didn't have that, we would still have general products liability law and general contracts law. And both of those things are going to be at issue when you're selling food in the marketplace. And food safety is implicated in both of those things, especially in the area of products liability. So I'm going to start out today just kind of laying the groundwork and discussing particularly the kinds of hazards, kinds of food safety hazards that we'll be covering in this presentation. And then Tony is going to jump in and walk through the law around general food safety liability. So let's get started. Basically, today, again, we're just talking about these general food safety liability principles. And if you want to know even more about that, you can tune into our second legal issues webinar, which we'll talk about at the end of this presentation. This whole thing is just designed to outline these general food safety issues. And to start with that, we're going to start by defining, hopefully, what food safety liability is. When you're talking about food safety in legal circles, you're generally talking about products liability, and in terms of food safety, we're going to categorize different kinds of potential liability based on the kind of hazard that is at issue. And generally speaking, those fall into biological, chemical, and physical hazards. Those last two, chemical and physical, we're not going to cover today. Today, specifically, I'm going to focus on biological hazards like bacteria, molds, and naturally occurring toxins. But there are definitely other things out there, and definitely if you're thinking on like the manufacturing side of food, chemical and physical hazards are more things that you're going to want to think about. But today we're going to focus on the biological hazard side of the equation. And so here we have some illness sources that are biological hazards. These are microorganisms that can grow in our food or on our food or in the soil where we grow our food. And these are generally, when we're talking about microorganisms and biological hazards, we're talking about bacteria, parasites, viruses, yeasts, and mold. These are probably things, if you're watching food safety news pretty regularly, keeping an eye on that kind of thing, you've probably heard of some of these things. Definitely, if you have eaten romaine lettuce in the recent past, you've probably heard about E. coli 0157H7. That's pathogenic E. coli. That's the really bad kind that can make people very sick. We're having a big E. coli outbreak right now around romaine lettuce. So that's been in the news quite a bit. We've also, in this microorganism area, we have Salmonella, Staphylococcus aureus, Listeria monocytogenes, Campylobacter jejuni, and Shigella. And I apologize, I am not a microbiologist. I think I said all those correctly, but those are your big bad bacteria that we're generally going to speak about in a biological hazard area for food safety prevention. There are also viruses at issue here. Norovirus is a really big one, as well as rotavirus and hepatitis A. And then there are parasites like Cryptosporidium parvum and Giardia lamblia. Those are the other kinds of biological hazards. These are things that you're probably not going to see with your eyeballs if you're walking out in your field and you're looking for poop like you would do if you were doing a part of your pre-harvest or assessment under the Food Safety Modernization Act. You're not going to be able to see E. coli 0157H7 or Campy or Shigella or norovirus. These are too small to be seen by the naked eye, but we can see these things in a lab. And I would encourage everybody, if you've got a way to see these things in a lab, if there's something nearby, I think it kind of helps inform your thought process around making a food safety plan. Because microorganisms, as it says here on the slide, don't recognize jurisdictional boundaries, right? They just, like life, want to grow, and they want to grow wherever is most amenable to let them flourish. And oftentimes that's going to be in our soil where we're growing our food, or even on the surfaces of some of the foods that we're growing. It doesn't matter if it's certified organic or not. Microorganisms don't care. They don't care how big your farm is, how small it is. They just want to grow. So part of what we have to do as growers is to think through how we can keep those things from growing, or how we can, if we're in a manufacturing process, maybe think of some kind of kill step that's going to eliminate those things. Because first and foremost, of course, we don't want to make anybody sick. Like, even if we didn't have any kind of food safety liability whatsoever, nobody wants anybody to get sick from the food that they grow. So having a food safety plan is really, really important. And it's even more important because we do have general food safety liability. And particularly when you're thinking about the kind of food safety plan that you need to put in place, you should probably know that most foodborne illnesses, indeed 90%, are from just 4 of the things that are on this slide, and that's Campy, Salmonella, Clostridium, and Staph. Those are some of the really big ones that you may need to be thinking about preventing, depending on what you're growing. I'm going to break this down a little bit and just kind of, I get the fun part of talking about all of the gross stuff, and then Tony gets to talk about the law. So this is where these things come from, just generally. So if you're thinking about making a food safety plan, or you have an existing food safety plan that you're curious about updating to be in compliance either with the FSMA, or just making sure that you're trying to think through compliance around general food safety liability and the general principles of that we're going to talk about in the latter half of this presentation. Here are some types of products where these particular bad microorganisms tend to flourish. So for Campylobacter, raw and undercooked poultry, unpasteurized milks, also contaminated water. That's why there's, I think, such a big lean in on the water testing aspects of the Food Safety Modernization Act, because we know that some of these really bad things do grow in water. E. coli is another one. You'll see contaminated water here, but also from ground beef, unpasteurized milk, soft cheese, and raw fruits and vegetables. Just as I said earlier, the romaine lettuce is a very, very recent example of E. coli. Listeria, soil and water, some animals, also found in raw milk, processing plants, ready-to-eat foods like deli meats and hot dogs, sprouts in particular for listeria. Listeria really likes to grow any place that it's wet. So any point where you might have water, listeria is a likely culprit there. And salmonella, we're looking more at contaminated eggs, poultry, and meat. Again, unpasteurized milk, you'll see that pretty much as a theme throughout a lot of these, as well as raw fruits and vegetables, and you'll see sprouts here again. For Shigella, you're looking again at contaminated water, again, more raw vegetables. Botulism, that's going to be more of a kind of a home hand one. We're not going to talk too much about botulism toxin today because we're focusing more on farm, so that's less of a worry, but it is still definitely a presence if you're doing any kind of canning. Improperly canned foods are really potential sources for botulism. Clostridium is another thing that gives people a lot of trouble in like ready to eat and cooked food that hasn't been properly refrigerated. And hepatitis A is spread again through, you see, contaminated water. And a lot of these things come from, you'll see a common theme. A lot of these things are coming from fecal oral route, that people not washing their hands properly after using the restroom. And again, if you've done that Food Safety Modernization Act training, or you plan to, you're going to hear a lot about proper hand washing, because that is just one of the main transmission routes for most of these pathogens. And norovirus is another one that's a very good example of that, just to continue on. You'll see that here, infected food workers, from vomit or feces. That's part of the way that norovirus is transmitted. Staph, also on skin, in your hair, nose, throat. In the FSMA, you'll see a lot about folks not coming to work if they're sick, and that's one of the reasons why. And that's not a bad idea to think about in just a general food safety plan, whether or not you're thinking about FSMA, that's a very good idea. Vibrio is Vibrio got a lot more common after sushi became a bigger thing on menus all around the country, because it is shellfish raw or undercooked shellfish is a really good breeding ground for Vibrio. So those are some of the kinds of microorganisms and the kinds of things that they can cause and the things that they can grow on and around. But really, I mean, we know microorganisms are everywhere. Some are good and some are bad. They even live in us. Like we have microorganisms in our gastrointestinal tracts that are actually quite beneficial. But then the ones that we just talked about are the ones that are not beneficial and pathogenic, can make people really, really sick, or indeed kill them, which is the worst case scenario there. Microorganisms in food come from a lot of different sources, as we discussed in the last few slides. They can be in water, they can be on the surface of fruits or vegetables, they can be in meat, they can very, very commonly be in unpasteurized milk. And they can cause disease if people do eat them. They can also lead to spoilage, but not always. So you can't necessarily just look at a piece of food and know, oh, well, that doesn't smell right, so it's probably got E. coli. Like that's not a way that will. It's not a good test for that. And different foods are going to have different spoilage levels. Spoilage, I bring up mainly just to kind of highlight that for later discussions of food safety liability about putting a product in the stream of commerce that might not be as good as it is warranted to be. That's a principle of law to think about that's outside of the FSMA, but that still is going to apply whether or not you're subject to the Food Safety Modernization Act or not. So the spoilage idea is something, maybe just put a pin in that and we'll think about it later when Tony's discussing the general principles of food safety law and contracts that are going to impact how you want to structure maybe a food safety plan. Outbreaks caused by microorganisms happen every year. This is showing from 2003 to 2008 the kinds of outbreaks, the kinds of products that were subject to foodborne illness outbreaks. You can see poultry is a pretty big one, and as this slide notes, this changes every single year. And this ends in 2008, and you'll see some things here in a couple of slides that are going to show you, I think, kind of how we've increased our eating of fruits and vegetables a little bit in the last 10 years, and that has resulted also in an increase in foodborne illness around the kinds of microorganisms and the kind of pathogens that typically grow on raw fruits and vegetables as opposed to in meat products. We have here, there's a couple of slides I want to walk through about just some of this is kind of a parade of horribles of what can happen if microorganisms are not properly addressed in a food safety plan. If anybody remembers the 93 Jack in the Box outbreaks on the West Coast, but that resulted in 4 deaths from E. coli. E. coli continues to be a problem, and most recently here we have the romaine outbreak, but this slide also encompasses the 2015 Chipotle outbreaks, and you can see just the difference in food companies, like the kinds of food products that are at issue here. Like in 1993, we have it was meat, it was specifically beef, Jack in the Box, but in 2006 it's spinach. Taco Bell, I believe that's scallions or green onions. I think that was that outbreak in 2006. And then the Chipotle outbreak, I think, was meat again. So again, it's E. coli with beef and vegetables both, and other kinds of meat as well. Salmonella, also you can see at issue with a wide variety of food here, from the peanut butter outbreaks of 2009, which actually resulted in some prosecutions under the Food and Drug Cosmetic Act from the Peanut Corporation of America, because they were not just negligent, but intentionally putting contaminated product. It was proved into the stream of commerce, which is obviously a very big, very bad deal. And we can go from the peanut butter to ground turkey to chicken and cucumbers. And I take a special issue with this slide because I got salmonellosis from the Cargill ground turkey outbreak in 2011. So I know from what I speak, it's terrible. I hope no one who's listening has experienced it. But and again, just to show that it's not just meat or vegetables, it's both. These pathogens, if they find an environment in which they will thrive there in the absence of good food safety practices. Listeria is another one, from the Jalisco cheese in 1985 all the way to the Jensen Brothers cantaloupe case in 2011. The Jensen Brothers cantaloupe case, again, is another one that actually had some legal prosecutions around the foodborne illness outbreak of Listeria. And botulism, as I mentioned earlier, botulism is going to be one that you're going to want to watch out for when you're thinking about canning products, especially. And you can see that here, both in hot sauce and in some home canned potatoes. But those were two issues with the botulism toxin. This is the slide that I mentioned earlier, just kind of showing the pathogens, particularly in produce. And this goes to 2010. There were 667 outbreaks during that time that were actually reported. And you can see norovirus is the really most common one here. And again, that's that fecal oral route transmission of people just not washing hands well enough. And that's part of the way that that particular virus is transmitted. And this is all just for produce. You can see salmonella is the second biggest problem, E. coli the third, and then everything else kind of breaks down into smaller categories from there. So we know what these things are, and we know a little bit of what they do, but how do we control for food safety? Thinking through our ingredients, our processing steps, and what happens after our processing steps, as well as on farm, all of those are going to be parts of thinking about a food safety plan and making controls inside your food safety plan to be able to prevent, hopefully, foodborne illness from happening and being tied to your particular product. So a lot of these have to do, this is going to be very different if you're in an on-farm space as a grower versus a processing space as a manufacturer. And just as a side note, for processing like that includes things that are processed in community kitchens. You still got to have a food safety plan for those. It may processing things in a community kitchen may pose some additional questions that you need to think through for your food safety plan, just because you are sharing that space. Tony's going to talk about allergens a little bit later, but allergens in particular is something you might want to think about with if you're processing anything in your community kitchen, where there are any of, especially the 8 common allergens that Tony's going to talk about. There might be, hopefully the person running the community kitchen is food safety trained and ready and aware of any kind of allergens that may be coming through the facility, so that you can know what kind of cleaning you might need to do, or what kind of preventative controls you might want to put in place to make sure that you're not getting any kind of cross-contamination in your product from any kind of allergens that have come in. But that's part of that processing control that you want to think through when you're thinking about food safety and food safety liability. There's a lot of different kinds of planning and planning tools that are out there, depending on whether you're doing manufacturing or food processing, or whether you're on farm. If you're in kind of a processing space, the hazard analysis and critical control point, or HACCP, maybe a thing that you want to look into, as well as the good manufacturing processes, that's GMPs for on-farm food safety, GAP certification, good agricultural practices may be a thing to look into in terms of controlling for food safety. And some of those things are things that your market may already be demanding of you. I know there are definitely growers out there who are GAP certified because that's what their market wanted them to be, and they wouldn't be able to be in that market without that certification. And same for good manufacturing practices on the food processing side, like the folks that you're selling your product to may have that as a requirement before you can even get the product in the door. Those are some of the things that may provide you with kind of a framework to think through how to control for food safety. But the other things you're going to want to know are a lot of the questions that are articulated here on this slide, and that is, what are the laws that apply to me? We're going to go over some of the general laws in the latter part of this presentation with Tony. Obviously, you're going to want to know what food you're working with and what that food's characteristics are, that being especially characteristics that will lead to the growth of any particular kind of foodborne pathogens. So if you're growing sprouts in particular, sprouts have a lot of heightened food safety discussions around them just because of the way that they're grown. They tend to be more of a hazard than other foods necessarily. So if it's sprouts, you may have some specific characteristics that you want to think through in terms of putting controls around how you're growing that and translating those controls into, you know, easy plain language for you and everybody else on your farm so that they can help implement your food safety plan. Like wash your hands is a preventative control step potentially in your food safety plan, but you might not write wash your hands in your actual food safety plan. It might be a lot longer and a lot more detailed, but on farm you're going to say to your workers, like, yes, wash your hands, and here's where you can wash your hands, and that kind of thing. You're going to want to know, obviously, also what you're doing with your food, specifically here, what your markets are, what folks are probably using your food for. And in that context, I think we're really trying to get at, are people eating this food raw, or are people cooking this food? Because there are going to be different level of hazards associated for your consumers depending on whether this is a food that's regularly eaten raw or whether it's a food that is generally cooked. So you probably want to know those just so you can understand how general food safety liability may apply, because what the consumer does with the food is important in that analysis. And that's all part of just doing kind of a risk analysis and liability examination in any kind of food sales setting, whether you're selling directly off farm or whether you're more of a processor manufacturer. Okay. Sorry. So why are we focusing on foodborne illness? Obviously, we've talked about, we don't want people to get sick. In a liability context, when you're thinking about potential liability for your business, we have gotten a lot better at traceability in the last 10 to 20 years around foodborne illnesses. We have much better detection systems. We say a lot, like it's like CSI for food now. I mean, really, the scientific community has allowed us, science has advanced to the point where we can follow specific strains of a foodborne illness with very, very great specificity, and actually kind of pinpoint where exactly outbreaks have come from based on the DNA fingerprint, really, of the food and of the particular pathogen. So we're actually able to track that stuff back now in a way that we've never been able to do before. So regulators, I think, and the law as well, just generally, has been trying to catch up with that a little bit, because we have these better detection systems now, liability is I think a lot more on, it's much more on people's minds, just because it's easier to find the culprit, basically. So if you've been injured by a foodborne illness, it's easier for a potential litigant to find the cause of their harm and try to recover some of that harm if possible. So that's part of why we focus on foodborne illness so much in food safety, just because this liability is much more, it's much easier to attach, I think, now, given the advances in science. And two, as I mentioned before, we're eating more fresh produce. We also have an aging population. That means we have more immunocompromised citizens. Elderly folks and very young children are much more likely to die from a foodborne illness than anybody else in the population, as well as anybody who's immunocompromised. So given the rise in fresh produce and our aging population, we've had more foodborne illness outbreaks, just because people are more susceptible as they age, and eating more fresh produce means that they're more likely to contract a foodborne illness. Again, I mentioned some of this a few minutes ago, but just immunocompromised folks, very, very much at risk of dying from a foodborne illness or becoming seriously ill from a foodborne illness. That includes people who have been diagnosed with cancer, children under 5 years of age, diabetes patients, HIV and AIDS patients, elderly persons, people with autoimmune diseases like celiac disease, and pregnant women. Like these are folks who are going to have the more serious effects from foodborne illness. This is a link to PulseNet, which is a national laboratory that's connecting foodborne illness cases that detect outbreaks. This is just kind of a food for thought sort of slides, a resource for you. So you can look back at the previous segments that we talked about, the microbiological issues, and then if you have a particular product that you're growing or processing and you want more information on the types of foodborne illness that might be tied to that, so you know how to better structure a food safety plan, PulseNet is a good resource for that. For food safety generally, who is responsible for food safety at a regulator standpoint? This is a governmental function because it's part of protecting the health, safety, and welfare of citizens. So the government does have a role to play here in the food safety arena. Typically, we're going to look at the USDA and the FDA as having responsibilities for rulemaking around a lot of different products. For the USDA, we know for meat and poultry and certain egg products, and for FDA, obviously that's pretty much anything else. We have also some standards that come from industry itself that are not just complying with the rules that are put out by these government agencies, but also setting kind of industry standards around food safety. Continuing to talk about our agencies in a little more detail, in addition to the FDA and the USDA, we also look to the CDC quite frequently for information on foodborne illnesses, investigation of illnesses and outbreaks, the effectiveness of prevention and control of outbreaks, and the CDC also coordinates with state and local health departments to do outbreak response when there is a foodborne illness outbreak. Obviously, state and tribal departments of health also have a role to play here in ensuring the health, safety, and welfare of state citizens and tribal citizens. Those are other actors that can be involved here in food safety. So in terms of knowing what laws may apply to you, those are all things that you may want to think about, not just federal, but also state, local, and tribal. Other FDA or other agencies beyond just USDA and FDA and CDC may have some responsibility in this area. Here are just a few. We're from all the way from NOAA to the U.S. Customs and Border Protection. There's quite a few federal regulators that have kind of an interest in ensuring food safety or some kind of degree of responsibility for ensuring food safety. In addition, the U.S. court system obviously is very involved. Both federal and state courts have heard cases related to food safety, going all the way back to the very beginning of the court system in this country. And a lot of what we're going to talk about today is civil law that's going to be in the courts. I'm not going to read through all of these. These are just some food and drug law and food law regulation resources. These slides will be available and you can get them from the handouts tab. If you're curious about any of these things, there are links here as well as ISBN numbers so that you can track down these particular publications. More resources here about food policy and food law related to food safety for food producers. And here are some of the laws that we're not gonna walk through all of these today because we're gonna be talking again about general food safety liability principles, but at issue here, especially if you're selling across state lines or across jurisdictional boundaries, then you're probably subject to federal law. So the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act is going to apply, the Food Safety Modernization Act, the Federal Meat Inspection Act, poultry products. Depending on what you're growing, some of these may be an issue for you. The FDA Model Food Code here is another additional resource, which is another good document, I think, to look at, particularly in a food service context. There's a lot of guidelines in the FDA Model Food Code. It's not a law, it's a model law. So it doesn't actually have regulations that you must follow, but there's some good guidelines in there if you're thinking through how you want to structure a food safety plan in a food service context, for example. And here, I think I am going to turn it over to Tony to start talking about food regulation in the US and general food safety liability.
Hello, everyone. White, Hospital Halt. My name is Sutitqua. Water runs downhill. I'm from the Colville Confederated Tribes. I'm happy to be here as a presenter. And congratulations to you for being forthright and attending these webinars and hopefully attending one of our on-site in-person trainings, because like Erin said, we all want the people that we serve our food to or grow our food for to be safe. So now we'll dive into the regulations and laws surrounding food safety. The food regulations in the US, Erin mentioned some of these. The Food and Drug and Cosmetics Act, Food Safety Modernization Act, which is why we've been charged with a lot of this work and groundwork in going throughout the United States doing these trainings, is through the Food Safety Modernization Act. And this act is the largest change in food safety in general in the past over 70 years. The regulation of food sanitation. Some of you have dealt with this in the area of your Indian Health Service if you have convalescent centers. Some of you might have dealt with this on reservations through your schools, daycares, Head Starts, regulation of meat and poultry, regulation of imports and exports. Some tribes, especially those on the East Coast or West Coast, are selling salmon, exporting their salmon. We have some Plains tribes that are exporting bison. Food standards, regulations of GMOs, food irradiation, which is a kill step in certain types of foods. It's an application. Hold on. Regulation of pesticides in foods, regulation of nutrition labeling and dietary standards, regulation of food advertising, toxicological principles for food safety, risk assessments in food and risks associated with food, chemicals, physical, microbiological, allergens, pest management, food additives, Bioterrorism Act of 2002, plant sanitation techniques, audit systems, international food regulation and international food regulatory agencies, dietary supplements, functional food and nutraceuticals, biotechnology, state regulation of food, tribal regulation of food, enforcement of federal, state, local, and tribal laws, recalls, civil and criminal lawsuits. Food regulations. Even donated food is exposed to legal liability. So we've heard, as we've gone throughout Indian country doing some of our trainings, and we've heard from some tribes that and producers that just assume that because they're on a reservation or on trust land, that they are protected in some way from these liabilities. Unfortunately, it's not likely that there's just a bar. Sovereignty doesn't protect you against everything. And when we're looking at examples, a great example to look at is tobacco. The FDA also regulates tobacco. When you look at the states and tribes and their relationship in the arena of tobacco litigation, you will understand then that tribes are not barred from investigation and liability. And so you look to food, and food enters the same type of trade across state lines. And so we want to make sure that you as a producer and as a tribe are looking at protecting yourself, getting ahead of the game by creating laws and regulations and understanding the federal laws pertaining to food safety. But even as it relates to donated food, there has been some limited protections provided. But again, even if you are donating food, there's never 100% protection, you always have to have some type of record keeping and protocols, methods in that you are doing your best to protect those that you're donating your food to. But we see some of the progress that was made in donating food. In 1996, the Bill Emerson Good Samaritan Act, it was passed by Congress. And this, as it relates to donated food, almost every state has adopted this, and it applies to donations of wholesome food and apparently fit grocery products. It excludes donors from legal liability except in cases of gross negligence. Gross negligence, voluntary and conscious conduct, including failure to act, knew the conduct was likely to be harmful to health or welfare of another. This is what you're trying to avoid, this gross negligence. Intentional misconduct, which is conduct harmful to the health and well-being of another, known at the same time of the conduct. That we want to make sure that tribes have some type of record keeping, that individual producers have some type of record keeping, that those that are going out, that are hunting and fishing, are digging roots, are medicinal plants, and then providing them as a donation, are doing so in a way that they cannot be called upon for being grossly negligent or having any type of misconduct in that act. In 2014, the 2014 Farm Bill, Congress authorized the donation of traditional foods to public settings in Indian country, recognizing protections from liability for such donations, but indicated relevant food safety laws must be complied with. So we look to Alaska as a model in utilizing this through the 2014 Farm Bill. They've been successful in introducing donated foods into health facilities, so elder care facilities is their big example, where they have menus that include seal, caribou, different types of oils, but that took a working partnership between those villages, those that wanted to donate, the state, various agencies within the federal government, all working together to make that a shining example of where it works. But in doing that, they have maintained that they are complying with food safety laws and regulations within the state of Alaska. Back to general liability. When food harm is caused, an investigation may be undertaken by state, local, tribal, and other federal authorities. If a lawsuit is filed because of injury or death, discovery of the facts, which is a form of investigating of the facts, ensues. So the first one is administrative law. The second one could be through civil. More recently, in some particularly egregious cases, criminal investigatory files are now being opened. And a good example of this is, we've seen this in the news with cantaloupe, and you've seen where they're now going after these producers for criminal liability because they were not acting in a way they didn't have the proper, within their processing plant, their food safety methods, their cleaning techniques, the equipment that they were trying to retrofit, all of the different things that they were doing were causing this to happen, and they should have known that it was going to happen. And because of that, because people have died, they're now going after them for criminal liability. The purpose of administrative investigations or discovery in a lawsuit is to find the source of the problem. The chain of custody, chain of evidence is identified by these investigations. Recalls can occur and lawsuits can occur. So when you're creating a plan, a food safety plan in your farm, or if you're a tribe and this is a tribal entity or business, make sure that you have a method for tracking your food, especially if it's leaving your reservation boundaries or leaving your communities. Finding the source. The source of the foodborne illness normally results from unsanitary conditions, problems in processing, storage, handling, harvesting, production, transportation, or other steps in the food chain. Contamination of or at the food source, contamination somewhere along the chain, unclean food handling at any step. Most foodborne illnesses can be traced to those sources which are generally preventable or avoidable. Following the chain of evidence, it's scientifically easier now with proper record keeping. It is logistically easier to locate where these start and then you can pull the bad food or create a safe zone around the food that you're trying to harvest or process. Tribes and tribal businesses, both individual producers, our fishermen, our fisherwomen, have been, unfortunately, and food business processing businesses have been attached to foodborne outbreaks. And even though they weren't the direct cause, they were listed. Salmon cannery was closed because of this on the West Coast and in the Southwest. A flour mill was closed because they were a possible potential part of an outbreak. Even though they weren't directly traced to these tribal businesses, the fact that they were listed was enough for those two tribal businesses to have to close. So tribes are already being affected by food safety laws. It's something that you as an individual or a tribal business need to know, that even though you are a tribal entity, a government, and you are sovereign, these tribal businesses have already been affected. Liability in the U.S. In the U.S., normally those placing food into commerce are held to standards of strict liability or product liability. Strict liability doesn't require intent to cause harm. So most states have adopted a strict liability. If you're selling food, it is good for you as the consumer or buyer that you don't have to prove the intent. But for that you, even though you don't have to prove that intent, it does make it easier for those that consume your goods to file a claim against you. It's still hard for those individuals. You have to, in most instances, when a food illness breaks out, the state is already going to be going after them. The federal government is going to be going after to find the cause of the foodborne illness, especially if a number of people have been sickened by it. And if a state or another administrative agency is going after trying to find the cause of the foodborne illness, it makes your claim easier. But if we are tracking our goods that we are producing, it makes it easier for everyone to find the source of those contaminations and stop them sooner rather than having an investigation ensue. You put into commerce, because you put it into commerce, and if you cause harm, you are strictly liable for the harm that you cause. Those harms don't have to provide the exact cause of the problem, only that there was a problem or some type that caused harm and you were in the chain that led to them getting sick or to death. Discovery focuses on finding the links in the chain. It then becomes your problem to prove that you are not the source of the problem. Again, that is why it's key for you to be able to track your goods that are going out from either you're selling it to the general public, or you're selling it to a cooperative or to a large corporation. You want to be able to track when it leaves your farm and where it goes. When injured by food, in the US, if you are injured as a result of a foodborne illness, you can do nothing. You can leave it to an administrative agency to take action, or you can file a civil cause of action in court, and compensation for harm is usually sought. The lawsuits will normally allege that someone is liable legally for harming you. Criminal liability is when the government seeks to hold somebody responsible for the harm that it caused to society. Actions imposing criminal liability might also occur. Historically, that was highly unusual, but that is changing, and the Jensen Farm criminal liability is an example that both Aaron and I have talked about today. To prove liability for someone's injuries, you need to prove legal responsibility to protect from harm. This is the duty of care. Liable party failed to protect. Injury resulted from the activity. Injury was reasonably foreseeable. And some jurisdictions will limit the liability by statute. Product liability. Food lawsuits fall into product liability categories. Elements to the claim: product was in a defective condition and it was unreasonably dangerous for its intended use. An example is food had salmonella or other pathogens within it. Failure to warn can also be a problem. Product contains allergens is an example. The defect existed when it left the source, the farm, the warehouse, the truck, the grocer, etc. The defendant must have been the proximate cause for the injury. From 2000 to 2011, there were 320 publicly recorded foodborne illness settlements and verdicts in the United States. There's a couple examples here. Warranties, even when there is no strict liability proven, you may still be held responsible for violation of warranties in the food. When goods are placed into commerce, warranties follow the goods. There are express warranties, written or stated, or implied warranties. Express warranties: the seller of the product, either in writing or verbally stated as part of the sales transaction, that the goods were of a certain type, quantity, quality, and were free from defects. Express warranties can happen when writing about the goods are exchanged between the parties. Goods meet certain levels of quality, language on the packaging. It meets all food safety standards. It's all natural. It's non-GMO. Various types of labelings can also occur when it is proven that verbal statements occurred during the sale. Warranties: did the business take reasonable care to ensure fitness and safety and merchantability? Implied warranties don't normally cover ordinary wear and tear, improper maintenance, or failure to follow instructions. Doesn't cover every possible failure of the product. Generally, there's no specific duration of the warranty. States will differ as to the statute of limitations on implied warranties. Tribes may also have laws that cover these sorts of issues. Warranties disclaiming: under the UCC, sellers of products can exclude or modify implied warranties, but in order to do so, the exclusion of the warranties has to be provided in a printed document, such as a sales document, and must be conspicuous. So you must see it right away on the package. In some cases, the UCC requires specific language in order to disclaim warranties. Merchantability and fitness: particular purposes require very specific language. Regulations cited earlier. We will discuss this more in our webinar number 2. Federal food laws also have very specific requirements or standards that require that food contain no harmful substances, are fit for human consumption, do not contain filthy, diseased, or animal substances, are not manufactured, produced, or unsanitary in an unsanitary way, are protected well on business premises and in transit. Some states, localities, and tribes may also have food laws that impose different language into the food sales transaction. Some federal, state, local, and tribal laws also speak to food safety requirements pertaining to donated food, not involved in sales transactions. And some jurisdictions may create exemptions from liability or limit exemptions from liability. Generally important steps producers or those in the food businesses can take. Manage your risk. Try and limit your liability. Manage your exposure to risk. Examine your practices and relationships. Get and keep insurance and read your policies. Expect higher levels of standards from everyone you are in business with, because their actions also impact your liability. Maintain records, have plans, including food safety plans, and keep up to date on regulations and laws, and go to trainings. Additional important steps: determine the standards applicable to you at the federal, state, local, and tribal level. Determine if permits are required or if compliance with regulations is required, and meet those requirements. We require that in each relationship you determine whether a written contract is required or an agreement as to mutual responsibilities. So if you have some type of product where either you're selling an ingredient into another product or something that's going to be mixed or processed together or sold together, know if that means you're getting soil from someone, if you're getting soil enrichments from someone else, knowing what is coming to you, then letting whoever you are then selling your product to, what your standards. That helps protect you. It helps protect those that you're working with. Determine whether a business entity type, what your entity, whether it makes sense for you or your activity. Business entities won't protect you completely. So this is how you're going to, your entity is your incorporation. What type of business are you? Sole proprietor? Are you a C Corp? There's various different types of corporations for agricultural in general. What type of business are you going to be? Records must be up to date, thorough, and properly detailed. And for some people, this might seem really daunting, or it might seem like it's not that big of a step because whatever you're doing might be so small. But even if you are exempt from FSMA and what you're doing is, it's not to make a lot of money, it's more of subsistence or donation, you should still have some type of records, even if it's just scribbling on a piece of paper. Cleanliness and sanitary and safety standards should be your top priority, but you need to be in a position to prove your actions and your standards. So if you have those written somewhere on a clipboard, your standards for cleanliness, sanitary practices, and safety, you're able to identify where those rules are. Your staff has been trained on those. That's the types of things that can help protect you. Train any and all employees and volunteers working with you. And also during our FSMA trainings, we also say, guests that come onto your property should also be aware of some of these regulations and rules, are good practices that you're including on your property while you're growing. So if that means not bringing in a pet dog that might go to the bathroom where you're about to harvest, those types of things, that all employees from the top down and the bottom up, everyone should be on the same page, but also those that are guests that come onto your property, or those that aren't guests that simply migrate through your property, whether it is wild animals or birds. Having a process in place and knowing when you might need to notify or have a policy or practice in place for all of those types of instances, invited guests and non-invited guests. Going back to general principles, you are legally liable for the safety of your product. If someone is harmed, you may be held responsible. It is possible to place your personal assets in your farm in jeopardy. This is an issue of general food safety liability and is separate from your responsibility to understand and comply with the Food Safety Modernization Act. Note that there may be general insurance policies that you can find and buy to cover your operation, like those covering some food retail. Here are some examples. The Food Liability Insurance Program, FLIP, and then for food vendors, caterers, food trailers, food trucks, commercial kitchens, farmers markets, vendors, and chefs. This does not cover animal, livestock feed, baby food, commercial farming operations, companies not in compliance with county, state, and federal food and safety regulations, grocery stores, and others. Check to see if your type of entity is covered. And gross annual receipts under 200,000. But as tribes progress, insurance companies are learning to work with tribes and understanding their unique jurisdictional differences, working with the tribe and through laws and regulations. So there might be tribes and insurance companies out there working together in agricultural or food safety areas that we don't necessarily know about right now. And if you do have an example, please let us know. We'd love to share your information, or if you have an example of an insurance company that you're using successfully as a producer, we'd love to share that information with everyone else as well. Allergens. This is a special note on allergens. There are 8 major allergens. Together, they account for 90% of all food allergens in the U.S. Labeling required under federal law and must be declared on any processed food. Allergens can be life-threatening for those who suffer. These 8 include milk, eggs, fish, crustacean shellfish, tree nuts, peanuts, wheat, soy, and soybean products. The importance of training. One of the most important things you can do is to keep up to date on new laws and regulations. Attend grower trainings for the Food Safety Modernization Act. We are out right now currently doing our produce safety training, but this law has been broken down into various sections. We will be going out with all good intentions, we'll be going out and continuing to do training beyond produce. Eventually, this will attach to animals. So keep abreast of the training that we're doing now. We're doing produce, but we will continue to do more trainings. IFAI is the Native Outreach Training, Technical Assistance, and Educational Organization for FDA and FSMA compliance. If you can gather 10 or more people within your community, we are willing to go to you in your community and provide a FSMA training. We like to keep the audience between 10 to 30 individuals, but if you can get at least 10, then we can justify paying for our lead trainer to help come put that training on within your own community. We are already scheduling grower trainings for 2018. They're on our blog right now, and we will update that on a rolling basis. In many cases, answers may be, answers may not exist to very specific questions because there are new rules, but our team can walk you through what we do know. And if you have a question that we think other people might want to know, then we can ask FDA those questions. And as they answer questions with a FDA clearance, we can try to provide those back to you. We can provide a grower training that will help. It helps everyone understand and improves on these new requirements so that everyone's aware of these requirements. And it will also help, even if you are exempt, you have to be able to declare that you're exempt. You have to understand why you are exempt. But these trainings are free to individual producers, to tribal governments. And it's not just about, are you a grower? This is a jurisdictional issue. This is a sovereignty issue, because eventually there's going to be people doing inspections to make sure that you're complying with this federal act. We at IFAI hope that we can train a cadre of investigators that are tribal, whether it's a regional group or tribes request to participate to be investigators across all of Indian country. We want to make sure that tribes have that authority. We've used the example as treatment as a state in water quality testing, as well as in tobacco investigative testing, which tribes can apply for that funding in the tobacco arena. And hopefully in the near future, they'll be able to apply for funding for inspections through the FDA. But in order to do that, we have to make sure that individuals are aware of these laws, that they are getting trained in through our trainings so that they will one day be able to do those investigations. Legal issues are number 2, are more, we'll cover additional topics. It will discuss specific requirements found in the new FSMA and the grower trainings provided. It will a discussion of how administrative processes work, more discussions about how you can deepen your understanding of legal liability issues, your operation, and how the rules impact your liability. So thank you for participating in today's training. Again, I'm Tony Stanger, and Aaron Parker did a wonderful job earlier in this slide. We will be presenting the legal issues number 2 training on the 18th. Thank you again for attending, and if you have any questions, we'll be on the line.
All right, thank you, Aaron and Tony. I just want to remind all of our attendees that if you have any questions about this presentation, now would be a great time to send those forward. I'll just remind you that you can use the questions box in your control panel and type in your question and go ahead and submit it, and I will read it out loud, and our panelists will answer it to the best of their abilities. So while we're waiting for some questions to come in, you'll notice that on your screen at the bottom, you'll see our website. I definitely encourage everyone to visit our website, go to our food safety page, and there you will find links to all of the webinars that we have in this series. You'll also see links to the regional trainings that we'll be conducting, including the ones that we currently have scheduled. And then you'll also just see a lot of food safety resources posted. So I would definitely encourage you to go to our website and check that out. I'll also remind you that Tony mentioned the part 2 of the legal issues webinar that we're going to finalize the date for that. That will be posted to our website once we have that date finalized. But I will remind you that our introduction to produce safety is our next scheduled webinar, and that is going to be on January the 18th at 2 p.m. Central. And again, if you go to our website at indigenousfoodnag.com/food safety and go to our the webinar section, you'll see that listed there, and there'll be a registration link so you can register for that webinar. I'm not seeing any questions coming in. Aaron or Tony, do you have any final thoughts before we close out?
This is Erin, and I will just say, we like to say in all of our food safety trainings for the Food Safety Modernization Act that if you didn't write it down, it didn't happen. So just want to emphasize again the importance of record keeping, whether you're thinking about general food safety liability or you're thinking about trying to do GAP certification or complying with the FSMA. No matter what you do, just keeping those records is real important.
I would just like to add that if you are interested in writing a food safety plan, we also provide some information on assisting you in writing your food safety plan. And don't get overwhelmed. It doesn't have to be something where you hire a contractor to come in and do it for you. And don't try to reinvent the wheel. There are a lot of examples, and we also have access to a lot of those examples to make it easier for you to do that. So please, if you can, within your community, garner 10 people that are interested in this. Let us know so we can get you on schedule to try to come to your communities.
All right, we did have a couple of questions that have come in. The first one is one that I'll take, which is, will any of the references be linked on the website? Once this webinar is concluded, the video of this presentation will be posted to our webinar page, and the references that were linked in the presentation, I will include that with the video. And so when you go to that page, once I post this video, you'll also see those references linked to our website. So yes, those references will be found on our website. We had another question that came in. Can you talk a little bit about the Meat Inspection Act and a workaround for tribes on meat that wasn't slaughtered but hunted?
This is Tony. So not very many tribes have rules or regulations on meat that you are hunting for. So, any type of wild animal, in deer, hogs, different things that you might be hunting and processing, but almost every state does. And many states are very, very clear on their rules. We have a partner in GLTFIC, the Great Lakes something organization.
Intertribal Fish and Wildlife.
Yeah, they have written a grant, and they are working on a code, a set of tribal laws as it relates to wild game that you are harvesting. And that is as it relates to donation and as it relates to sale. And I think there's a 1-year turnaround on their code that they're developing. And we are working on our national model food code right now too, that we're moving into our last year of our model food code. Well, we are upon completion, and we will include the section that GLTFIC comes up with on as it relates to wild game. But right now, there's really no example of a tribe. So I suggest you go to your state first. But as far as donations, you can also look to Alaska and the model that Alaska has used in donating their food and their protections of liability. But again, it depends on what state you're in, how much you're processing, what you're trying to process. And there's different types of meat are regulated by different entities within the state, but also within the federal government, the FDA or USDA. So it's complicated, but we're hoping by next year we'll have shed a little bit of light on that, and we will have given tribes the tool within a code to have their own laws as it relates to either traditional hunting or gathering or commercial hunting to sell or to donate.
Sure. And this is Erin, and I'll just add, in terms of a food safety plan for meat that's like wild game meat that's been hunted, some of the big culprits there in terms of microorganisms are again going to be E. coli L157H7, salmonella, and also trichinella, which causes trichinellosis. And there are some prevention and proper cooking guidelines that anybody probably needs to be thinking through if they're selling or donating wild game that state laws are probably going to consider when you're thinking about the kinds of food safety practices that would lead someone to think that you had made that good faith donation. For example, under the Bill Emerson Act, you have to comply with some of those food safety regulations, even under Section 4033 of the Farm Bill, which allowed for the traditional foods donations that Tony's referencing there as part of Alaska wild game donations. A lot of that came out of Section 4033 in the Farm Bill, but there is still a food safety component even in that donation piece in the Farm Bill. So either way, whether it's trying to work around the FMIA, I don't know about that specifically, but you want to keep in mind those three big pathogens and just have a plan to control and prevent foodborne illness, whether it's wild game or not.
All right, and we did have somebody offer a point of information. The Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission is the organization working on hunted meat policies, and it's a 3-year grant. They have a 3-year grant to work on those policies.
Thank you to whoever provided that specific information.
We did have another question that has come in. Our tribe gets a lot of salmon, which is smoked and dried and given to the elders and those in need. How do you address traditional methods of food preparation and with current food safety?
This is Erin, and I'll make a quick comment, and then I think I'm sure Tony will also want to chime in. But I will say, every time that I've talked about food safety to anybody at any kind of conference in the last 2 years in Indian country, this question has come up. I think it's a lot on people's minds, and that's very, very understandable. It's a good question. This is one of those areas where, with FSMA especially, like it's a new law, and it's a very untested area. So there may not be a specific answer to this yet. Part of the answer, I think, is part of what Tony just articulated around the wild game question, though. I think having a tribe that has laws on the books, tribal laws, putting arms around food safety principles for things that are, especially for things that are traditional and traditional methods of cooking and preparing food, squaring those up and harmonizing those with federal law is going to be a thing that I think only a tribal government's going to be able to do. In the absence of that, I'm not sure where else to go. I think this is a function of a tribal government to be able to say these traditional preparation practices are safe under tribal law, and to be able to prove up to federal regulators why that's so. And there is underneath, alongside the Food Safety Modernization Act, tribes can request a variance to actually take on that piece, and to take on the whole food safety piece, but you have to have tribal laws on the books around food safety. So that's why projects, I think, like the GlyphWIC project and the Model Food Code project that we as the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative are rolling out are important, because it's a starting point for a tribe to look at code and say, okay, like how do we incorporate our traditional methods of processing our traditional foods into this code in order to say that it's safe if these practices are complied with. I know that's kind of a long and rambling answer, but I really do think it needs to be a tribal law. Tony, do you have thoughts?
I am from a tribe that has a lot of, our entire cultures revolve around food, and our longhouse tradition revolves around food, and the way that those foods are processed is very unique. And I'm married to a Navajo, and so we have joked that we know that the Food, Drug, and Administration was not thinking about burying and cooking food in the ground, and are a Navajo woman hanging a sheep from a tree in her backyard butchering. There are various practices in our culture and how we process our food, the songs that you pray when you're planting your foods, and medicinal foods too, plants and herbs that they weren't thinking about at all. And if you look at the entire Food Safety Modernization Act, they don't mention tribes, indigenous, Indians, anything. So there's no clear exemption, but there's also nowhere that they've included us. So that's why Janie has voiced the tribe's concerns throughout this entire process of them advertising and finalizing these rules and regulations, and why the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative is so important to give that voice. Because right now it's not black and white. We're not fully exempt, but at the same time, we as Indian people and our tribal governments need to step up and say, here are our rules, our regulations, here's an area where you do not get to come in and inspect us or talk to us because this is a cultural practice. And so it's up to each tribal community. But as far as protecting your own people, I think that for thousands of years and time immemorial, the way that we have processed and cooked our food and save our food has been in a way that's sanitary. It's not only kept us alive, it's the reasons why anyone that's ever been on this continent has been able to stay alive by the practices that we use as Indigenous people. But like Aaron said, the elders in our community and the toxins that we might not be responsible for putting into our environment are there. And so we need to make sure that even if we are using a practice that we've used for thousands of years, we don't know if there's contamination in the water, or in the air, or in the soil. And so those are the types of things that you as an Indian community need to be aware of, or as a producer, that even if you're using the best practices that have been handed down for centuries, you need to know what's in your water, your air, and that you're not making a community of elders or young children susceptible to any type of harm in what you're doing. But that's why we're writing our food code, is to lay out some of those rules, and why we're out here doing FSMA trainings. But as far as liability in those instances, it's up to each community where you're in. It's in the state that you're in. There's not a lot of precedent in the court right now as far as actions taken against individual tribal producers. But then you look at, are you leasing your land out to non-natives? They are liable. If they are selling, like my tribe, we lease a lot of our land out. If we're selling anything, cherries, apples, that are contaminated, are if those outside entities they are liable. So for us, it's about protecting yourself right now, having those laws on the books, thinking about not only the practice that you are in, but the contamination that could occur outside of your own authority, the water, the air, the soil. Sorry, that was a long answer.
Thank you, Tony. We did have a comment that came in. Dr. Barbara Roscoe and the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission have extensive work on salmon harvesting and utilization.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. While Tony was talking, I realized I needed to bring up CritFic and the awesome work that they're doing. Thank you so much for bringing that up. Yes, look up the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission. I know, I think this is squarely an area that they've been thinking about, so thank you.
And CritFic is helping us in writing our fish section of our model food code. They're one of our partners.
All right, we had another one that came in. Where do coastal tribes find laws for aquaculture, wild-caught fish, and shellfish, whether for community functions or resale, local and commercial?
I would look to CritFic and also look at speak to the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission. But CritFic is writing that section of the code for us, but they already have some of that information on the books. They're already supplying various trainings to fisher people, fishermen and women on handling and sales. So some of that information is already available through the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission, but also the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission. And also UCUT, so all of the various Northwest tribes that are fishing either on the river or on the coast.
And as for regulations that may apply to you, some of that is going to be a matter of state law, so it's going to depend on your particular state as to jurisdictional issues.
And a follow-up question, when you say we, Tony, who are you referring to?
I've said we a bunch. I probably said recently, but when I say we, as in this new food code that we're writing, yep. we, the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative, have written in to the work that we're doing. We're not the experts on fish, the Indigenous Food and Ag Initiative. So we requested that the Columbia River Fish Commission work with us, and and then as far as wild animals, GLITFIC is working with us. We're also working with the Intertribal Agriculture Commission. So we have various other organizations and entities that are helping us in developing this model food code.
All right, that brings us to the end of our questions. Once again, I'd like to thank all of our attendees for tuning in today. It's been a great presentation. And I'd like to also thank our panelists, Aaron and Tony. You guys did a great job. Just remind everyone that this webinar, the video of this presentation, will be posted to our website in the next few days. So please go to our website at indigenousfoodandag.com/food safety, and you'll find it there. You'll also see, you'll also find a listing of all of our upcoming webinars and links so that you can register for them. We thank everyone for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.